I am a planner and group facilitator based in Philadelphia, and I have a lot of what I've learned over the years has come from the National Charrette Institute. So I'm happy to be sharing how the ideas from NCI Charrettes are still shaping my work. Um, so I have a presentation today that I expect will take about 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion. Um, just to give you a brief overview of where we're going on our journey here together, I'm going to introduce you to what this project was and talk a little bit about how Charrette principles shaped the project approach, the kinds of tools that I use to support this design sprint being fully virtual. And then I'll wrap up with what I'm calling celebrations and cautions, things that came out of this design sprint and things that worked really well. And then also some things that either didn't work so well or cautions about ways that I wouldn't try to do this with certain topics or audiences. And then, like I said, we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussions. That's usually the most fun part. So this is an example where I was responding to a call from a client that I had worked with previously. They had a kind of vague idea of something they wanted to do. They were interested in bringing together multiple government departments and different agencies to collaborate on what they called a concept plan for a downtown transportation network. Basically, they were trying to figure out, which roads should we prioritize for which modes of travel: bike, peds, transit, freight, and vehicle volumes. And this is in a very constrained downtown, and so every street can't do everything. And it's like a giant puzzle piece of trying to figure out where to thread through these priorities. And they wanted a quicker, cheaper way to develop options and kind of vet them and narrow them down than your typical detailed engineering analysis approach. They wanted to be able to generate lots of options and evaluate them in a more subjective way to narrow the options to prioritize the funding they did have for that more detailed engineering analysis. And they had heard this thing called a design sprint and thought that's what they wanted. But other than that, they didn't really have any specifics about what they thought that looked like. And a key reason for doing all of this was to build shared understanding across the different agencies and across the different kind of what they described as silos of the different modes. However, they came to me in sometime in 2020, I think in the summer of 2020, they wanted to have this sprint either in the fall or in the spring. And so it had to be fully virtual. We knew that from the beginning. So as I thought about this, I'd heard the term design sprint, but I hadn't really looked into it that much. And as I started reading about it, it sounded to me almost exactly like an NCI urban design charrette, except that the term design sprint really grew up in the software development and product development worlds. And so some of the language was different, but there was still the idea of having a very compressed time frame, having broad stakeholder collaboration, working across silos, having frequent short feedback loops, and getting into real details. So in design sprints, they very often develop an actual product prototype. In urban design charrettes, we try to get down to detailed enough design work that the real conflicts can come out. If you're just talking about maybe goals and objectives, people can agree on lots of things that when you get into the specifics, then they start fighting about. So when I tell people what an urban design charrette is, I've always said and this is what I learned from NCI, that it is a collaborative, multidisciplinary, week-long design session with short feedback loops that's held on site. And all of these concepts really influence all of my public engagement work, even when it's not done in a charrette format. To me, these are principles that can be built into many different kinds of engagement methods. And they definitely influenced how I thought about this particular project. So the client came to me with this, I noodled it around a bunch, and then we started working together. There was a consultant team that was me and a transportation engineering firm, and then the client group. And the core client group included one of the transportation planning departments and the transit agency. So this small group started working together to prepare for the sprint. And there were a bunch of things we did as part of that. I had several conversations with them to really nail down what were their goals and specific outcomes they were looking for out of this design sprint. Once that sort of gelled and became a little more clear, then we started identifying what were the key subject matter issues that were likely to come up during this planning work, and pulling together the data and maps that would be needed to address those issues. So the transportation engineering firm pulled together some existing conditions analysis and really built a data dossier to have on hand during the sprint. We know with this kind of compressed time frame of either an urban design charrette or a design sprint, we need to have all of our data right at hand. We don't need to be scurrying around trying to hunt something down. The client also set up some pre-sprint presentations, held in virtual video meetings like this one, to brief the work team that would be doing the sprint work on some of the key issues of the different travel modes. So we had one presentation from the bike planning team about the status of the bike network and bike planning. And specifically, these presentations were focused on what are the kinds of design criteria that these different modes have to keep in mind in terms of their operations and planning. And what is already decided and done and what is still open for negotiation. We also worked to make sure that we had enough staff who would participate in the design sprint who were trained to use the key mapping tool we were going to be using, because I knew that we wanted to use breakout groups to get more work done faster. And so we had to have someone trained in that tool for every breakout group. And then we had several conversations in this planning group about who to involve in this design sprint. And that included which agencies, which specific staff from those agencies. Should we include any outside stakeholders like neighborhood groups or business improvement districts or say bike advocacy groups? There was a lot of discussion back and forth about the pros and cons of that. In the end, after a fair amount of discussion, it became clear that the client here really thought the most important thing was that the different agencies could be completely candid with each other, that breaking the silos across the departments and agencies was really the most important outcome from this process. And to support that, we said, at this point in time, this is going to be an inward-facing collaboration, not involving members of the public. So in the end, we did not include advocacy groups, neighborhood-based groups, and people like that. This was not resulting in any final decisions, and it was not resulting in any public document. It was really building a sense of shared understanding and teamwork across these silos and agency barriers. And of course, we also work to develop the sprint schedule, think about what kinds of group activities we would be doing during the sprint, and developing the materials to support those activities. So we came up with very specific product outcomes we were looking for, a concept map identifying specific locations to prioritize various modes, a clear statement that everyone could agree on about what the criteria were for evaluating those concepts, an analysis of the pros and cons of the different ones we came up with, and some short-term actions that could be done at least within the next 5 years, if not faster. But just as importantly were process outcomes about shared understanding of the criteria that are important for the different modes, what unresolved questions or constraints we still need to work on, and just generally having more understanding and cooperation across the silos. And those process outcomes affected how we thought about the breakout group work, because there were times when we structured the breakout groups to have like each breakout group was a silo. So it'd be the bike group and the ped group and the traffic group. But most of the time, we were structuring the breakout groups to have someone, to make sure there was someone from each of the kind of silo barriers in every breakout group. A really important part in our mind was that we wanted people to be very focused. One of the key principles of an urban design charrette is that it's a week-long effort, meaning it's work that happens in a very compressed time frame, and that one of the benefits of that is that people really focus. Another benefit is that you have this momentum that carries forward. You're not suffering from all of this cognitive task switching by having meetings being a month apart and forgetting what you were working on. And so even though we were going to be working virtually, we emphasized to people that we wanted their full attention during the work times. Now, we put together this kind of framework schedule, and those of you who have done urban design charrettes may recognize this schedule very much. I was the one who really designed this schedule, and it was almost entirely influenced by my training from NCI and experience with urban design charrettes. So we started with a kickoff presentation. We had a series of work sessions. We had an interim presentation to get feedback from a larger group. We refined our concepts in the next set of work sessions, and then we had a final presentation. You'll see in this schedule, though, that we've identified kind of different sets of people that are doing different pieces of work. And again, this is sort of influenced by my experience with urban design charrettes, where you have a core design team who comes on site. They're there working the whole week. But as they're working the whole week, different things are happening. There are stakeholder meetings where a focused group of people is coming in. Maybe all of the environmental advocates are coming in for a meeting, or all of the transportation advocates are coming in for a meeting. And then there are larger check-in points, pin-ups, presentations, where a much broader group of stakeholders is coming in. And all of this is happening with a series of feedback loops. So all of those principles went into this schedule. Now, since it was internally focused, we didn't have those public stakeholders, but we still had this separation of a very core team and a larger team. And so I want to explain how we conceived of the different groups. Our kind of basic group was the sprint work team. And this was a group of about 20 to 25 people from all of these different agencies, representing all of the different modes and issues. This was our worker bee group of people. These are the people that were participating in essentially all of the sprint sessions. Then we had what we called the sprint core team. This was a very small subset of the work team. It was about 4 or 5 people. This was essentially the client and consultant project managers. So we had one person from the transportation planning agency, one person from the transit agency, and a couple of people from the consultant team. This was the group that all of us booked basically all day of the design sprint days to be available. We didn't know how much additional work we would have to do each day. And so we cleared our calendars to make sure we would have time to do work in between the sprint work team sessions. We also had a slightly larger group that we called the steering team. That was the group that was empowered to make decisions about how the sprint would run, what needed to be accomplished on each day. That was basically the core team plus their immediate bosses. And then finally, we had our larger group we called sprint stakeholders. This included agency leaders, department heads, section heads. This was the higher up folks who would be really making decisions about any implementation of recommendations coming out of this design sprint, and a few additional agency staff who may be interested in the issues. This was the group that was invited for those opening, interim, and closing presentations. So our day had a similar rhythm every day. We had a 3-hour work session in the morning. Immediately following the 3-hour work session, we had our steering team check in about, okay, this is what we got done today. What do we need to get done tomorrow? And then our core work team had 3 other hours blocked off in the day in case we needed to do data analysis, collect data, and for me to do the facilitation work of figuring out the detailed agenda for the next day. Now, because this was fully virtual, we used a bunch of tools to support the work. I didn't even realize how many different virtual tools we used until I started putting this presentation together. We used both Zoom and Microsoft Teams for our meetings. We used Zoom for the work sessions because it has much better support for breakout meetings, breakout groups than any other of the video tools. But all of these agencies have Microsoft Teams in their, on their work computers, and they primarily use Microsoft Teams for their work calls and work video meetings. And so we used Microsoft Teams for those presentations, for the larger stakeholder presentations. That also gave us a little comfort since we were doing work sessions right before the presentations to get ready for the presentations. We knew that people wouldn't be dropping in on us while we were still making the sausage. We used Miro, which is an online whiteboard tool, as our primary organizing hub for the sprint. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. During the broader stakeholder presentations, we used Mentimeter as a polling software to get some quick feedback on things. And then for the mapping tool, we used Remix. This is a transit agency planning, transportation planning mapping tool that both the transit agency and the transportation planning department were already using. And so they built a set of data layers in Remix for us to use during this design sprint. And they made sure that one of our consultant members had access to it and was trained in using it. This was the tool that we wanted to make sure at least one person in every breakout group knew how to use this tool well. So as I said, Miro is an online whiteboard. There are others. Miro is just one brand. Mural and Google Jamboards are similar tools. Miro has several templates available you can search, and they have several design sprint templates. And that was one of the things I looked at in preparing for the sprint, to think about how do I do this all virtually? Like I said, I had experience running urban design charrettes in person. I'd never run a full 5-day charrette virtually before. So in the end, I didn't use any of these templates directly because most of them really were developed for product design, product development, software development. But I borrowed a lot of their kind of organizational structure, and I borrowed a few specific pieces of showing people how to use the tools. So this is what our whiteboard ended up being at the very end of the design sprint. I can't show you, I can't zoom in enough for you to see all of these little details because this really was an internal agency collaboration. And so there's confidential information on here I can't share with you, but I do have a whiteboard template we can go into if you want to see how some of the Miro tools work. But I just wanted to show how the organization of this whiteboard helped us have a central hub to, it really gave us a gathering place almost. It gave us a sense of community, even though we were all, at home in our various offices. The whiteboard was set up in these columns. So the pre-sprint work was the first thing on the whiteboard on the far left. And then each day has its own column. Now, when we started, the only thing people saw when they came to the whiteboard before the sprint was this little bit of information on the far left. As each day progressed, when the first day started, I had everything set up in this column, but the only thing that was showing when people first arrived at the beginning of the first day was the schedule and the agenda. And then I would uncover the various tools we were going to use for the day. And then at the end of our work session in the morning, we'd have our steering team meeting and decide what we were going to do the next day. And then I would set up whatever tools we needed to support the activities we were doing for the next day. And in the end, this gave us a central place that we kept referring back and forth to the material on different days. And we even used it for our final notes of what should go into the report. One accidental good idea I think we had is that we wanted to give people background information before they came to the sprint. And we decided to do that by using Miro so that they would have a little bit of exposure to this tool before the sprint even started. So instead of sending them attachments or PDFs or anything like that, we sent them a link to our Miro whiteboard. They saw the overall schedule, our goals and objectives. They got a little bit of instruction in how to use the primary tools within Miro. And then we asked them to try it out by introducing themselves and telling us something about how they wanted the transportation network to change. These were, many people in this group had met each other before, but not everybody had met everybody. It was one of those kinds of groups. So we wanted people to start getting to know each other. And then we had a whole data library of PDFs, copies of the pre-sprint presentations, maps, resources that we thought we might need. So we had a link to a Google Drive with that. And then we had also just 4 maps that we were fairly certain we were going to want to refer to over and over again. So those were pasted directly onto the whiteboard. Now, one thing that worked very well was that we had a kind of similar schedule every day. We started with an overview of the specific outcome we were trying to get to in that work session, what our tasks were, a simplified agenda. We did our work session, and then at the end of the day, we had a very short 5-minute kind of daily evaluation of what worked well and what we could improve. I think that gave people a sense of rhythm that helped, again, with the kind of cohesion, even though we were all dispersed. Like I said, we had every day, we also had the steering team check-in and time for our core group to prepare for the next day. Now, of course, on the back end, I had a very detailed day schedule. So the The broad framework was set from the beginning of, say, we have a work session where we think we're going to refine concepts for our presentation. We're going to give our presentation, then we're going to have a check-in. But each day I would then prepare the detailed timed agenda with the very specific activities and prepare the whiteboard tools for those activities. Again, another Charrette principle that we used was this idea of multiple feedback loops. And when we had our presentations with the larger stakeholder group, we did use this Mentimeter tool to get those larger groups had 30 to 40 people. And so we use this tool to get feedback on the specific concepts and ideas to figure out what to drop and what to keep moving forward on. So what happened here? What did we end up with? I think we did end up with a kind of shared sense of vision about how all of these different modes could interact and work together in this downtown network. The different silos developed a better understanding of the design criteria for the different modes. We did reach broad agreement on some specific locations for prioritizing various modes and specific issues or questions that we needed to answer regarding those locations. So there were 2 specific corridors that were identified as opportunities for substantial improvements. We developed 4 different options for those 2 corridors. 3 of them at the end of this 5-day design sprint were still considered viable. We're still considered, these are worth further evaluation, further analysis. And we had specific questions that we needed to answer about each of those options. We had one option that we had discussed fairly extensively that everyone agreed it was not viable. And so it was no longer under consideration, but we included it in the internal sprint report to document, yeah, we really thought about this and there are good reasons it's not being considered further. So how did the Charrette principles really affect this effort? So a Charrette is collaborative, multidisciplinary, week-long with short feedback loops. It has both design and planning, and it's on-site. So we gave very careful thought about who to involve, how, and when. This was a very collaborative piece of work. It just was collaborative internally. It was collaborative across agencies. It was not a public-facing, public engagement effort. But that's true of urban design charrettes too. The very first urban design charrettes were developer project management charrettes, not public engagement efforts. And I know urban design firms who still use non-public charrettes as a working tool for collaborating with city government agencies and developers prior to going out to talk with the public. So this was multidisciplinary. We were cross-agency and cross-mode split silos. This was a 5-day, very focused effort. Because of scheduling limitations, it wasn't 5 consecutive days, but it took place over about a week and a half. So it was still a quite compressed time frame. We did get in 2 full loops of idea development and presentation. We got down to specifics enough that it wasn't just kind of broad platitudes. And it wasn't on site in terms of being in person, but the whiteboard did really give us a virtual site to gather around. So what worked well here? The Charrette-like schedule with the kind of rhythm to every day and a framework schedule for the whole week that then became more detailed for each day as we went. That worked very well. Involving the right people at the right time. So, it was very important to have some of the section leaders and agency heads engaged, but we knew we couldn't expect them to spend 3 hours 5 days in a row, or 3 hours over 5 days in a week and a half. So we involved the right people at the right time. Our core team had a shared understanding of the issues, the end goal, and all of the tech tools because we worked on the pre-sprint preparation in such a collaborative way. And I will say I have kind of become a convert to virtual work over the last couple of years. As a longtime facilitator, I had always resisted virtual engagement. There's something magic about people being in the room together, but working virtually really enabled a much larger set of participants, especially those participants at key points. This is a large region. People are working in different cities in the region. It might take them an hour and a half to travel to get to a meeting. And even for the people who are all working downtown, if you're going across town, it can take half an hour. So working virtually enabled more people to participate. And it didn't require physical space, carting computers, travel. There's a ton of logistics in doing on-site, in-person charrette work. But I do want to give a few cautions for any of you thinking about doing this at home. Don't count on anybody doing homework. Most people did not do the pre-sprint work that we assigned. Some people did, enough people did that it worked fine. But it was really important that we had our core team collaborating on all of this ahead of time, because our larger worker bee work team, most of them didn't do the homework. We did have a few tech problems, and one of them was really important, and I didn't know about it until the end. There was a key participant from an agency that really needed to be involved who had Zoom issues all along the way, and they were not able to fully participate because of that. Because I wasn't the primary contact for the stakeholders, so I didn't know that that person was having a big issue until the last day of the design sprint. I would say this is something to talk about with the core team. Whoever is the contact person for the participants needs to know how important it is for people to get access. And even if I were doing this again, I would have a pre-sprint session using the tools I was going to use for the sprint and checking to make sure everyone had access. Working virtually requires a lot more preparation for collaborative discussion. There's just less organic interaction. People are more hesitant to speak up. I have found over the last couple of years working virtually, people need much more structured activities and much more explicit directions for interactive work virtually than they do in person. On the other hand, you don't have to do nearly as much logistic work ahead of time. This design sprint really depended on very heavy reliance on all of these different tech tools. It worked well for this group, but this was an all professional group who was already using most of these tech tools in their professional work. The whiteboard was new for people. The Mentimeter polling was new for people, but everything else people were already using. I would not use the same method for engagement with the broad general public. I do think virtual is slower. People don't get quite as much done. In the end, this group was really pleased with how much they got done. People expressed in the final evaluation surprise that they were able to get as much done as they could in this fully virtual way. But they were still a little disappointed that we didn't get even more done. And I think if it had been a fully in-person session of all the same time, we would have gotten farther on vetting these options. So just expect that if you're developing virtual engagement or collaboration sessions. And, for my purpose, I don't get any great people pictures out of it, but the benefits of enabling more people to participate with less travel time across, a broad area, I think outweighs some of these negatives. And with that, I want to stop talking at you and see what kinds of questions and discussion people would like to have.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Do you want me to read the questions in the chat, or do
Let
you?
me see. Let me just scroll through. There aren't
Okay.
that many. I think I can scroll through. So I see one here about, was I the sole facilitator? I was the sole facilitator. I did have a team of people. I would say there was me as the facilitator. My consultant group had 2 transportation planners, one transportation engineer, one transportation planner. And then the client team had a project manager from the transportation planning agency and a project manager from the transit agency. And the 5 of us were that core team that blocked off our time every day. We had all been involved very heavily in the pre-charrette, pre-sprint work. But I was the only one kind of designing the structure of the activities and then running them. I would say because it was an all professional group and this core team, when we had breakout groups, we usually had 3 or 4 breakout groups. So there was somebody from the core team was in each breakout group meeting, and we had a shared understanding of where we were trying to get to. So that was very helpful. Again, I have used breakout groups in Zoom and other settings for general public engagement. And in those cases, you really have to have an active facilitator in every group. I would say this, because it was a professional group working in their areas of expertise, they were largely self-facilitating in the breakouts. I see a question from Andrea. Hi, Andrea. Great to see you here today. Notable hurdles with getting desired, needed participants involved. Okay, so that's a good point. We planned this really far in advance. I didn't tell you that. We started talking about the design sprint in like September of 2020. It actually ran in, I want to say March or April of 2021. So we worked together like with the client group for probably 6 weeks or 2 months before we had fleshed out who we wanted to get involved, how much time we thought it was going to take, that sort of thing. And then they reached out to schedule it, and they scheduled it really far in advance. So because we knew, especially like the agency heads would have trouble blocking off their calendars. I think at the time that they started scheduling it, it was more than 2 months in advance at that point. So we didn't really have trouble getting people engaged and involved because this was an issue everyone cared about. And we did the plan, and we did the scheduling far enough in advance that they could do it. After action efforts, I have asked this client a couple times, like I run into them every so often and I say, what's going on with this? I would say that this was the most important after action effort was really the process outcomes, not so much the product outcomes. There are several other planning efforts going on that are related to these topics, and all of the people are carrying these ideas into those planning efforts. So it's not so much that this created a strategic plan or an action plan or something that had specific items people could check off. It was that it kind of directed people's attention in different ways for these planning efforts that are going on now. So I would say in this case, the client was doing this partly to get everyone having a shared understanding and a shared vision because they knew that these other planning efforts were coming down the pike. And these other planning efforts could have been very siloed, and they did this to prevent that from happening. If you were doing this to actually come out with a checklist of things that you were going to do after action efforts, I would say the other thing that we didn't do as part of this that should be done having that core team continue meeting afterwards. Let's see. Okay, appreciate the thought and consideration that went into your process time. What tips do you have for building in the importance of a well-buffered schedule? Yeah, I fight with clients about this all the time. I mean, Holly's even seen me fight about it with her. I'm like, that schedule is too packed. We can't get that much done in 3 hours.
Always a struggle.
I don't know. I don't know what to say about that, except that I'm always bringing it up. I think it's super important for people to be able to focus and give their full attention. And I can only give my full attention for 2 or 3 hours max, 2 hours really. And then I need a break. And so I'm always kind of pushing people in that way. If we're going to have a longer than 3 hour session, we have to at least have a 5 or 10 minute break somewhere in the middle. I think I was lucky in this case because remember I told you we started talking about this around September of 2020. I don't know if everybody's forgotten September of 2020 in the fog of the last 2 years, but we were all slightly traumatized at that point. So the client was open to me saying, I know you want to do a design sprint. I don't think we can make people be on Zoom all day long. Let's have a focused 3 hour session and we'll do our core group can do the in-between work. But let's really get people focused and get their attention for a good working session instead of if we do it all day, people are going to be off checking email and not paying attention to what we're doing. And I think because of the timing of it, people were really open to hearing that. Yeah. And if somebody wants to, talk, feel free to use the little raised hand button. I can unmute you and we can actually talk verbally with each other, or you can keep putting comments and questions in the chat.
Jennifer's facilitating her own webinar. Yes. I don't need to do anything here. Jennifer, I kind of a follow-up to one of the questions about kind of after actions and more on, you talked about the whiteboard being the community space, or in my head would be kind of like your studio.
Yes,
where everyone
it was
is
very
gathering.
Much like the studio for a charrette.
Do you have any, and I know that it's really hard, you talked about how it's hard to organically have conversation, and we've found online it's hard to build relationships in that way. But when you talk to the clients after the fact, and it's been a year-ish, do you have any sense for that relationship side of things and what the design sprint helped launch, I hope?
Yeah, I did. In fact, one of the clients I saw just a few days ago, and I asked her about it. And she said she really does think it has, it solidified, almost everyone had met each other. They just hadn't all worked together in a focused way. And especially like the bike people and the bus people or, hadn't always worked that closely together. And she said that she thinks that experience really built those relationships. Right now, there's a big bus network redesign effort happening. And that was part of the reason why the city wanted to do this internal agency collaboration, because they knew that was coming. And, I love all my transit people. If there are transit people on this webinar, you guys are great. But sometimes transit people get a little, focused on just the transit operations. And so this was a way of making sure, that the people doing the bike planning were paying attention to there are real limits to where the transit can go. There are fixed points it has to connect to. And so there are some streets that are going to have very heavy bus volumes, and there's no change in that. And so we need, the bike people need to accept that. And then the bus people are understanding more about what the bike people need. And she said that has actually really helped going forward.
Great. Thank you. Another one in the chat for you.
Yeah. So, hi, Jay. It's great to see you too. How can we get to know what apps and tools are available and best suited for different processes? Um, yes, this is an ongoing problem now. I actually have I didn't pull up this link ahead of time. I do have a little blog blurb on my website at hfadesign.com on matching. It's not just about virtual tools, it's also about in-person engagement, but it's matching tools to the purpose. So I think there are great tools for giving presentations. There are different tools for asking survey questions. There are different tools for supporting discussion and that kind of engagement. Um, to me, it's just an ongoing learning thing that we're all in now. And um, every time I like to try out every new tool I can find. And then I like to ask other people what tools they're using and what tools they're finding work well for them. Um, I think there's a balance between finding exactly the right tool versus making it too complicated. So in this case, we really thought of the whiteboard as our primary tool. Zoom was our primary video tool. And then all of the other things were kind of supporting because they met a specific need. I don't know if that answers your question, Jay, but I think it's a big challenge right now because there are so many tools out there.
Jennifer, gave me time to, I think, find the
Yes,
blog. I put that in the chat. And
Yep.
then we have a resource tool for online engagement tools and techniques. Jennifer's stratifies it more and is more detailed. And mine, NCI's, is now 2 years old. So a lot changes.
Right, exactly.
So we have a hand up. I'm going to go ahead and allow them to talk, and go ahead.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All righty. Hi. Thank you so much. My name is Alani Boykin. And speaking of tools, I'm just curious. I'm unfamiliar with Remix and looking forward to finding out more about it. What about that tool made it why did you select it for this particular design sprint? Is it because it has a particular feature that's great for transportation related discussions, or why did you make that decision?
So I will admit that is the tool I know the least about. We used that tool for this design sprint because it was a tool that the transit agency was already using for their transit planning work. And it's a very easy mapping tool. If someone is already, is a little bit familiar with it. So it was very easy we had 4 people on the team who had accounts with access to the tool, and the transit agency could set up basically a set of data layers. So we had a data layer for the existing bus network, a data layer for the existing bus stations. There are bus transfer points, all of the existing streets. I forget what else. They had a bunch of data layers, and including demographic data. They had like polygon shapes for different demographic data, so that they could very quickly during our design sprint, draw on the map. Okay, what if we put a bus priority corridor here? We need a bike lane within half a mile of this location. What if we try this one here? So there was it was like doing a whole puzzle of the bus has to go here because of the transfer station, but our closest bike lane is all the way over here and we need one closer. And there was a lot of that back and forth. But the reason we used that tool really was that was a tool they already were using. They were familiar with it, they knew it, and they thought it would work well for this process. And it did work really well. And then that's the limits of what I know about that tool. It's a transportation planning tool. And I think one of the reasons the transit agency uses it is it has features in it for doing things like times of bus runs and things like that. We didn't use those kind of advanced features in this design sprint, but that's why they use it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm curious if anybody has tools that they have used that they think would work in this kind of setting or would be good in this kind of setting. If anybody wants to share something. I see Jay's hand is up too. Let's see.
Hey, Jennifer.
Hi, Jay. Yes.
Hey, how are you? Hey, one quick question was like, why didn't you use the Zoom polling tool? Is there a difference between the Mentimeter? I've seen that used in another meeting, but they were on Zoom, and I was wondering why they didn't use the Zoom one.
For those larger stakeholder presentations, that's when we were using Teams. And personally, I hate Teams. I don't like it. But all of these agencies, like I said, their agencies use Teams. And so during those three, the opening presentation, the interim presentation, and the final presentation, we were on Teams, not on Zoom. And the other thing I really like about Mentimeter is it instantly creates these great little visuals that show it's not just like the average poll result or a summary. It actually gives you a little frequency distribution. So for instance, in our options, there were a couple of options where like there were a couple of options where the average score was about the same, but one of them, it was a kind of normal curve of where people fell on how they scored it. Another one, about half the people scored it very low and about half the people scored it very high. And on Mentimeter, you can see that that's the outcome. And so then we could talk about why, people were so split.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the primary reason was we weren't on Zoom at that point. We were on Teams.